Good evening, everyone. We are looking at Psalms 119, and we are carrying on with our next section, which is the section on the letter Hey. As you can see that Psalm 119 is what we call an acrostic psalm. And if you have followed from the start, you'd find that we have covered four letters of the alphabet. We have covered the Aleph. There's just, let me put it on the side, the Aleph, the Bet, the Gimel, and the Dalet, which we finished last week. Today, we are in the fifth of these segments, which is the Hey. And so what you can see here is, as usual, I just want to point out to you that you find that every verse begins with the same alphabet, which is this one here. Verse 33, 34, 35, 36. All right. And then you'd find right here 37, 38, 39, and 40. Now, if you go down one verse into 41, you'd find that the next letter starts, which is the letter Vav, which is tomorrow. And so this is what we call the acrostic psalm. And so we are going to start from verse 33 today. In verse 33, from here on, you will notice a very interesting pattern that the beginning of every word of every verse is an imperative. It's a direct request in the second person, and it is in what we call in a Hiphil form, meaning a causative, to cause oneself to do something, to act on something, and the action is done onto the speaker himself. And so, if you look at verse 119, verse 33, it begins this way: "Teach me, O Lord, the way of your statutes, that I shall observe it to the end." As usual, we'll spend a little bit of time to break this down into the Hebrew. The word "teach me" is a good way of expressing. It really comes through as an appeal to God, and you know God's name is Jehovah, and it's to appeal to Him to, how should we say, to point out, right? To point out, to instruct, and to teach. This is a good word, and it's very vivid in the sense that the base word or the root word, in this case, comes from the word yara, which means to throw the finger, meaning to point. And so in that imagery, you can see that when you're asking God, point me the way, that's what the whole picture is trying to say here. The word teach is to ask God to point us to the way. It says here, the way of your statutes. The way means the path, right? The path of your boundaries. Now, let's pause here for a little bit. You could say that commandments come in different forms, shapes, and sizes, because we have seen commandments, precepts, word, what else? Statutes, judgments, They are all different words, but they carry the same basic understanding that these are all coming from God. Instructions that comes from God, which you would understand this as the Torah. And Torah is the base word that literally means throw the finger, right here, which is Yara. So it is essentially as a prayer by the psalmist to God, point me in the direction, in the way of your boundaries. One of those things that God has taught, how to work within the framework of what God has given, so that if in the event you cross, there will be penalties. That's what boundaries are for. And so we have the word statutes right here, which is very similar to, say, the parliament passing a statute, an act. And the act really describes what you can do, what you can't do, and what are the penalties that comes along with it. And that's what it means by boundaries. The boundaries of the freedom that's been given to us to observe. And then it says here, and I shall observe. Now, the word observe means to watch over. Watch over. And it says in the English, watch over it to the end. Unfortunately, the word doesn't quite mean the end. And so let me just briefly explain this to you. The word really means, it has something to do with the heel, right? And if you remember, the name for Jacob, Yaakov, is grabbing the heel. And so this gives us an imagery of steps, where you take a step, right? A step in the right direction. And so the whole intent to show us is that this means that the psalm is saying, point me to the way of your statutes, which the statutes will show where the path is that we are to walk. And when we walk in the path, we are guided by the boundaries to walk, so that we will not walk away outside the boundaries. And this is to mean the steps of the psalmist. And obviously, yes, it is to step all the way to the end of the journey. But it really needs us to understand one very important concept of the Hebrew culture, which is very similar to the Oriental culture. The Hebrew culture, like the Oriental culture, is very preoccupied with today, because they are all very practical people, right? Very pragmatic. What does that mean? It means this: they are not the kind of people that will look way into the future, because when they look into the future, they see the horizon. And what's beyond what they can see, they're not interested. And so there is a concept called olam, which is far into the distance, the expanse of the world. And what is beyond that horizon, they're not interested. It's considered a secret that belongs to God. And so they are very interested in what is today, the next step. And so steps is important. They are not running far into the distance, they are walking. And that's why you see in the entire Bible, you find a lot of this word called walk. And it's always about walking. And so watching over the statutes of God to the steps that one is taking, I think would be a fair way of describing this, right? At every step. And so instead of to the end, at every step would be a better way of representing the verse. And it will rhyme and it will resonate with Hebrew thinking and Oriental thinking, so that you're not looking way into the future. You're concerned about your next steps, and that's the more practical approach to life. And that's how verse 33 looks at that. We look at verse 34. It says, "Give me understanding, that I may observe your law and keep it with all my heart." You see, the same words are appearing, but they are not really the same words. So let's look at this. Verse 34. Verse 34 starts by saying this: "Give me." The word literally means cause me, right? Cause me to discern or to understand. Not give me understanding. It is to cause me to discern. Show me how I can understand and perceive and know what you want me to know, that I may observe. And the word observe again is watch over, look over, be very careful to guard over it, your law. And by law, this is the word Torah, which means instructions. You see that teach me, O Lord, and your law is in the same context, right? In the same context. Observing it is also the same context. The whole idea here is to guard it with all my heart, wholeheartedly. Meaning, it is not, well, I guess in the modern day, we're thinking about half-hearted, meaning we're not really all the way committed. We might try it out. We might do it when we're free. We might do it if it does not cause us any encumbrances. But the psalmist is really showing us the important parts of life is to know God and to know what he shows us how to walk and live, basically, how to conduct our lives, and is contained in the Torah, which is also called the statutes here. And the Torah is the instructions of God for our lives, that I may, or I will, watch over it, pay attention to it, and really eyeball the instructions of God, and that he may keep it wholeheartedly, because he knows that these are words that God has laid out for him. And that's how the psalmist is looking at the law of God. Now, I guess we need to just take a pause here to look at the structure of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is comprised of three components, or is structured in three sections, which is the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. And in English, we would call this the law, the prophets, and the writings. Now, the book of Psalms is the writings. That's what we're looking at. And whenever we read from the book of Psalms, and here it says, your Torah, your statutes, they are all looking backwards to this. Now, let me explain this. This is a very interesting concept. The law of God, or what we call the law of God, and I think law is a misnomer. I think the instructions of God would be a better word to use. And these are instructions that God has laid out in the 5 books from Genesis to Deuteronomy. And all the what we call laws, statutes, and judgments are found right here. You will never find anything new in anywhere else. That's the interesting observation. God's Torah is complete by itself. And when you see the Nevi'im, you see the applications of the law. The writings will point back, remember, it will point back to the Torah. And so here in verse 34, it says, cause me to discern. Make me understand. Understand what? Understand the Torah of God so that I can watch over and I can guard it with all my heart. That's how verse 34 will come about. And that's how we would understand that to be. So remember this concept of the Torah. It is not just the law. Now, obviously, sometimes the entire Tanakh or the entire, what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is sometimes referred to as the Torah. By context, we'll know. But in this case, when the Psalms refer back, it is referring back to what God has spoken through Moses to the Israelites in the time where they were about to enter into the promised land. Why? Understand this. The promised land is also commonly called the land that God has given by covenant to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the promised land really is God's land. And with God's land, it must be based on God's rules. And where do you find the rules of the land? The Torah. And that's how the Israelites would understand that they are governed by God's laws, because they are entering into God's land as God's people to be under God. And that's how they would view the Torah. Quite different from how we would. In the next verse, you would find in 35, make me walk, also has this same idea. Cause me, right? Cause me to, how should we say this? Cause me to tread or to track. It is a form of walking, right? It's a form of walking, but this is a form of walking that is one step after another. One step after another. Again, gives us this same concept as this word. And you find that sometimes this word is translated as march. That's how marching is. One step after another in its pace, right? In its pace. And where do you think the psalmist is saying, cause me to march? In the path of your commandments, for I delight in it. And this is an interesting expression. First, the path. The word path here gives us the idea of a pathway. You know, when you've got a road and people have walked on it, you find that that pathway is a very clear way amongst the grass. And that's what it means by the pathway. You know, when you keep walking, the grass will not grow on that path. And this is what this word path actually means. Not the path here, not this one, not this word, right? And generally it tells us this is the path of your commandments. So it's using the path to tell us this is your commands. So if you walk on that path, you are keeping the commands of God. And so verse 35 says, cause me to step, to march into that little walkway that many people have walked on. That is your commands, because we will always want to listen to God's commands. Because, the word for is because, I delight in it. Now, the word delight comes also from Psalms chapter 1, verse 2, right? For I delight, take pleasure. When you take pleasure, you would, how should you say, you would incline yourself. You would incline yourself to the commands of God. Very much Psalm chapter 2 concept. Those who delight in the law of God, and that's what it means, delight yourself in the law of God. But in this case, the word it has a very interesting concept. The word it refers to the path, not the commandments. The path of your commandments. Obviously, the path includes the commandments, but it's talking about the path here, so that you may continue to walk on it. So that's the imagery, the concept there. And it helps us to understand that we want to walk on where everybody is walking, and the path is God's commands. And so for I delight in it is you delight in walking in that path. You delight in that very path because it leads us to life. It leads us to God. It pleases God. And that's the tone of this segment of the Hey verses. Our next verse is verse 36. And it starts this way: incline my heart to your testimonies and not to gain. And the word here, dishonest, is added in. And I want us to pay attention to this. The word incline doesn't quite make the explanation, right? It means to cause my heart to, well, I guess cause my heart to stretch out. No, stretch out literally does give us an idea of incline, but essentially to stretch out, to reach out, to touch, right? To touch and to make decisions. Because the word heart here is about the mind. And so the prayer here of the psalmist is, cause my heart to reach out to your testimonies, your reminders, things that God has done. Things that God has done. And we will talk about it over and over again. That's what it means. And that is what our heart, our minds, our decisions are to be inclined towards, right? Inclined towards. That's where your, well, lack of a better word, your focus in life should be. And not to gain. Now, understand this. The word gain literally means to profit. But in invariably, most of the time, it is with reference to uh, unjust, or here in the New American Standard, dishonest gain, where the psalmist is saying, look, our focus in life should be on the good things, the great things God has done, and to mimic that, to follow that, to be faithful, to be truthful, to keep integrity, and not to profiting in an unjust way. And that in itself is very interesting, because if you have a chance to go to Jerusalem and you go shopping, I would love to introduce you to different shops, the Palestinian shops versus the religious Jewish shops. Now, how do you know a shop is run by a religious Jew? They wear a kippah. I think that's one very good indication. And they are very strict in doing their business, because they bear this in mind, not for dishonest gain. They deal very justly. The book of Proverbs is filled with these statements, that we do not have unjust weights. And so everything they do and they treat in their transactions are very honorable, but they are not claimed for any discounting. And so when they say 1 kilo is 40 shekels, you will get 1 kilo, and you will not get less than that, and most definitely never less. And that's why they charge you 40 shekels for whatever they say. And they would not treat kindly to any proposition of any discounts, because they pride themselves in an honest profit. They make their money because of what they tell you they would do, and they would do it. And that's how they would make their money. And that is what this verse is saying. God is faithful. God keeps his integrity. He does what he says. And so here the psalmist is saying, let me not do the dishonest way. Let me not do it the unjust way. If I were to do anything in life, it needs to be like how God has done it all these years, that we have been repeating year in and year out, the things that testify to God's faithfulness and trustworthiness. That is verse 36. In the next 4 verses, it continues on what we call the causative mood. It says, turn away my eyes from looking at vanity and revive me in your ways. Now notice, remember why I said your commandments, your precepts, your ways, your words, your Torah, your instructions, they all have different nuances. It's what God has said that we must do. And that's the theme of Psalms 119. And it says it in so many ways. And so the theme of causation here in verse 37 says this: turn away my eyes from looking at vanity. Now, the Hebrew context, the Hebrew words are generally very action-oriented, very concrete. When you say very concrete, it means that there are things that you can actually see, touch, feel, smell, and taste. And so this word turn away literally means to cause one to pass over. And so how do you cause your eyes to pass over? This is about eyes, right? What you can see. So it says this: if you're looking at A, B, C, and D, let's say we have our eye here, right? And our eye is actually to look at these things. The word cause my eyes to look away means this: I do not want to look at B. And so help me just skip over, pass over B. And so when you scan, you would see A and you quickly dismiss B in your line of sight. And then you see C and D. And so B is given the understanding that this is vanity. So help me not see from looking, right? And the word look means to see, to inspect. What else can you understand from this? From considering, right? Give attention. These are all the same words. And so the idea here is when you're looking at A, B, C, and D, the moment you come to B, you would quickly skip over. You're not going to give attention to it. You're not going to inspect it. You're not even going to consider it. And what is B in this case? The word B, this word, vanity, it actually means emptiness, right? It actually means nothingness or worthlessness. Or you could say that this is something that is bad or evil in God's eyes. So help me just pass over. These are not worth looking at. These are things that I should not pay attention to. God, help me just move my. So you notice this is a very intentional thing. So that when the psalmist looks at things that is by imagery offensive to God, help me just skip over it and revive me in your ways. The word ways here is the way to live. And revive means to keep me alive. Help me live according to how you want me to live. And so how does God want the psalmist to live? By passing over, right? By skipping over, by passing over what is offensive to God. And hence, by passing over that, the psalmist says, I will continue to live according to the conduct that you have laid out for me in your words. And that is verse 37. And you notice, skipping over vanity or things offensive to God is an intentional and it is a choice. One cannot say, oh, I have been shoved or into my mouth, so I have no choice, but I have to eat it. And this is not that kind of a concept. So the picture that Psalm 119 verse 37 is giving us is that it is one that is offensive and we choose to skip over it, to pass over it. Ask God to give us a strength to withstand the temptation. Right? That would be verse 37. Verse 38. Verse 38 says, establish your word to your servant as that which produces reverence for you. Okay, we need to unpack this a little bit. The first word is always a causative word, right? Cause your word to stand, right? To stand by your servant. Okay, this is important. cause your word to stand. Now, what do you mean by cause your word to stand, right? Cause to stand means make it come true. Okay, then make it sure. Sometimes it's translated as fulfill, right? That's what it makes it come true. Establish it. That's how the New American Standard uses it. So may your words, make your words become real to your servant. Remember, your servant is one who obeys the master. And who would be the master in this verse? That would be God, right? Jehovah. And so may his words, whatever God has said, to make it come true, because that would be a better word than as, because this produces reverence for you. I think that is a bit difficult to translate. Let me just translate this way. Because that is your fear. Okay? It does not mean because that produces reverence for you. Understand this, that when a servant obeys the master and the master establishes and makes real the words that is said by the master, which is God, it will cause, and understand this, your fear is the fear that belongs to God. The fear that rightly, maybe I use the word rightly, belongs to God. Because we can be afraid of many things, but the one that we must always be afraid of is God. And that is why you call it, it says is your fear. Because when you obey your master, you would understand that is truly displaying the fear that rightly belongs to God, because he is the master. That is how verse 38 comes to bear. That we, the servant of God, will be afraid of God because he can judge, he can be a consuming fire, and he can make what he says come true. And fearing God is something which is lacking in our vocabulary, because we like this word reverence. But that word reverence don't quite express the Hebrew concept in verse 38. The Hebrew concept literally means your fear, the fear that rightly belongs to God. Why? Because man must fear God. And when man does not fear God, then man will not obey God. And so if we call ourselves the servant of God, then we ought to obey God by fearing him. Because we know that if we do not obey God, then God's wrath may come upon us. And God's wrath is like a consuming fire. That's how the Israelites, the psalmist, would understand that. Now, in our world today, when we say pay reverence, it appears to, well, I guess for lack of a better word, it appears to have watered down the understanding of fear. And it tends to make it know what you want reverence to be. Whereas in the Hebrew context, when it's so concrete in nature, fear means fear. Be afraid means be afraid. There's no variation that you are afraid a little bit and he is afraid a little bit more of God. When God judges and brings fire down from heaven to destroy certain people in the Torah, that is how they would repeat those events, so that when we understand how serious God is with regards to obedience, then it inculcates the fear of God in us, the fear that rightly belongs to God, which is called your fear. It is not that we are so terrified we don't know what to do, but it means that in everything that we do, we make sure that we have considered God in it, and hence the word servant. Verse 39. Verse 39 gives us this: turn away my reproach which I dread, for your ordinances are good. Now in verse 39 says this, at least in the Hebrew, another causative word, cause me to pass over my shame, my disgrace, which how should you use this word? Which I fear, which, maybe we could use this word, which we dread, which we fear, right? Which we are afraid. It's a different word from this word fear, right? This is a different word. This literally means to be fearful of something that is not God. Okay, I don't have a better word to say, but essentially this is the kind of fear that the psalmists don't want to be engaged in. Cause me to pass over the shame which I'm very afraid of. What is that shame? The shame of not doing what God wants. And then we have what it says here, his ordinances, right? His ordinances, which are judgments. When the judgments of God are pronounced, it brings shame. And that is usually what happens when you read the book of Leviticus with Nadav and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, who were killed by God inside the sanctuary. How do you think Aaron would have felt when Korah and his gang came to challenge Moses? Why can't they also become priests? Why must it be Aaron? That was another interesting and shameful event for the family as well. And so this is the idea. The shame comes when God determines his judgments. And so turn me away from the judgments so that you can avoid judgments. So when you avoid judgments, you are not doing anything that leads to such judgments. For your judgments are good. This is the word, are good. Good in the sight of the beholder. Remember, good and evil is always in the sight of the beholder. And so for your ordinances are good, for your judgments are good. Well, in the eyes of God, it is good, because that is what God has wanted it and has determined for the judgments to be. And so the psalmist is realizing that God's words are good, that we are to observe it, to keep it, so that you do not do anything against it, for fear that it may come back and haunt you and disgrace you. That also continues this causative. No, do not walk wrongly, basically. Our last verse for today is this verse. Behold, I long for your precepts. Revive me through your righteousness. Now, in verse 40 is starting with the word behold. Look, pay attention to this. And it says, I long for. I long for means I desire intensely. I long for your mandates, what you want to be done, and so that I can do it for you. What you want, I will do. So revive me. So revive me means keep me alive through your righteousness, through your justice, through what is right before God. And basically, we are always looking at this picture. I hope you remember this picture. It's about walking, and we have the law, the mandate, the word, the justice. You know, we have all these words to describe this path. And the path or the way essentially is how to conduct ourselves. And we are walking step by step this direction. And this is important for us to understand because that's the whole imagery. You do not want to step away from the boundaries of the path of God. And hence, this will keep one alive. Keep living in the Word of God. Keep living by the Word of God, because God's Word is also life. And that's how verse 40 is now expressed. So, in a nutshell, in these 8 verses, it's basically really praying to God to avoid doing the wrong things. And remember, it's an intentional decision. It is not by accident. And these are things that we will encounter in life, which is vanity, which is worthless, which is offensive to God, that we must avoid so that we can keep being alive, walking the path step by step in a march. And so the psalmist is not one that is looking forward to the next 10 years, 20 years. What's that going to be? The psalmist is looking at the next step. The next step. So that you are not going to fall down in the next step. What is the point of looking at 20 years, 30 years down the road if you can't even take the next step? And the reason being is that once we are taking our eyes away from the front of our road, there is always a good chance that we may miss the mark. We may miss the guidance. We may miss the barrier, the boundaries. And that is what the psalmist is saying. Help me, Lord, cause me to walk in this path so that the conduct of my life may be pleasing to you, that I may desire your word. Notice these are all intentional words. They are not accidental words. It's not that I feel that your words is nice today and it's not nice tomorrow. It is by realizing that the words of God is the very source of our lives, and that the psalmist is saying, let me pay close attention to it, that I desire it, I lean towards it, so that I do not choose paths that leads me away from God. And so if there is anything that I'm looking right now, help me pass over those that is offensive to you, and help me be your servant, that we can always fear you every day, that every step we take, every decision we make, it is always in light of fearing God in his all-consuming fire. And that is the fear that rightly belongs to God, because we call him God and Master, and that we are his servants. So you see a number of different relationships that are painted in these 8 verses of Psalms 119. And I hope that we can actually learn to be intentional in our actions, both to stay on the path and also to avoid leaving the path by not paying attention to things that are offensive to God. And with this, we come to the end of verse 40.